All right, so today we're going to deep dive into something pretty important, I'd say, Alzheimer's disease.
Oh, yeah.
It's a major global health issue, and actually it's the 7th leading cause of death in the U.S.
Wow.
Yeah, and chances are you probably already know someone who's been affected by this disease, either directly or someone in their family.
Absolutely. It's a devastating disease. And, finding effective treatments has been really challenging.
For sure. And so the article that we're going to be looking at today, it's called Survival Time in Alzheimer's Disease, an overlooked measure of safety and efficacy of disease-modifying therapies.
Okay.
And it was published in Advances in Clinical and Experimental Medicine, which is the journal of Wroclaw Medical University.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so the author, Markku Kurkinen of Neuroactiva, suggests that we might be approaching Alzheimer's treatment a little bit from the wrong angle.
Okay.
He argues that how long someone lives after diagnosis, their survival time, should be the real measure of a successful treatment, not just whether or not it reduces amyloid plaques in the brain.
So not just focusing on that one thing.
Exactly. Yeah, and so to kind of give you a little bit of background, there's been a massive focus on amyloid beta, which is the protein that forms those plaques in the brains of people with Alzheimer's.
Right.
And the idea was that if we could just eliminate these plaques, we could stop the disease.
Right, like a magic bullet.
Yeah.
Get rid of the plaques and you're good to go.
Exactly.
And we've seen these new anti-amyloid antibody drugs like, Aduhelm, lecanemab.
Right.
But there's kind of a catch.
What's that?
So, there's been all this excitement about them, but the evidence that they actually slow down cognitive decline or truly make a difference in patients' lives is still pretty thin.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and some studies even show that they don't meet what's called the minimal clinically important difference threshold.
And what does that mean exactly?
Basically, it means that, the improvements these drugs offer are so subtle, they may not even be noticeable in daily life for patients or their families. Yeah, so, Kurkinen raises the question, if these drugs are supposed to be so groundbreaking, why aren't people actually living longer?
Right.
And this is where the concept of survival time comes in.
Interesting.
So survival time, or ST, is simply how long someone lives after being diagnosed.
Okay.
Think of it like how we judge cancer treatments. If a cancer drug helps you live longer, it's considered a success.
Right.
Kurkinen argues that we should apply that same logic to Alzheimer's.
Okay, so instead of focusing on reducing amyloid, we should be looking at whether a treatment actually helps people live longer.
Exactly. And there's a pretty compelling case for using ST as the key measure.
Okay.
For one, it's objective and easy to track.
Makes sense.
It's just a number. And plus, it reflects what matters most to patients and their families. More time together, more experiences to share.
Absolutely. It's more human, isn't it?
Yeah. It's a more human-centered approach, for sure. And it helps, cut through all the noise and all the potential biases that can come with these subjective cognitive tests.
Yeah, I can see that.
Because, let's be honest. If you or someone you love were facing this disease, wouldn't you want to know which treatment offered the best chance of more time?
For sure. I think we all would.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
And Kurkinen's article suggests that we might be overlooking some potential in existing treatments when we just focus on amyloid.
Okay.
Those traditional Alzheimer's drugs like donepezil, also known as Aricept and memantine.
Right, the ones that are often described as just symptomatic.
Exactly. The idea was that, they just helped manage symptoms, but they didn't actually change the course of the disease.
Right.
However, Kurkinen highlights evidence that using these drugs long-term might be linked to both a slower functional decline and a longer survival time.
Oh, wow. So we may have underestimated these so-called symptomatic drugs.
It's possible, yeah.
Huh.
It raises some interesting questions about how we evaluate and utilize existing treatments, especially in light of their potential impact on survival.
Yeah. So where do we go from here?
Yeah, it really makes you wonder, if we've been so focused on amyloid that we've missed other important avenues for treatment.
Right. And Kurkinen doesn't stop at just pointing out the potential of these symptomatic drugs.
Right.
He goes a step further and proposes a pretty radical idea for future Alzheimer's drug trials.
Oh, really? What's that?
He thinks we should be using donepezil or memantine as the control group.
Okay.
Instead of a placebo.
Instead of a placebo.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty radical.
It is a bold suggestion, but ethically, when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. If we already have treatments that might offer some benefit, shouldn't all participants in a trial receive at least that level of care?
Yeah, it seems like it would be almost wrong to withhold a treatment that could potentially be extending someone's life just for the sake of the study.
Right, exactly. And From a practical standpoint,
Hmm.
using these existing drugs as a control would give us a much clearer picture of whether a new treatment is truly superior.
Right, because you're comparing it to something that potentially already works rather than just comparing it to nothing.
Exactly.
So-
And this approach could actually speed up the process of finding truly effective therapies. We wouldn't be stuck waiting years for results from placebo-controlled trials.
Well, that's a good point. Yeah.
It's about, getting these potentially life-improving treatments to patients sooner rather than later.
Absolutely.
And Kurkinen even suggests looking back at historical data
Okay.
from past Alzheimer's trials
Right.
and analyzing survival times.
Interesting. What could we learn from that?
Well, it could potentially uncover hidden patterns
Right.
and give us some valuable insights into the long-term effects of different treatments.
Yeah.
You know, we might find that some drugs that we dismissed as being ineffective actually had a positive impact on survival, but it was masked by our focus on amyloid.
That's a good point.
Yeah, so there's a chance we might have been overlooking effective treatments just because we weren't measuring the right thing.
It's very possible. Yeah, and it really highlights how important it is to stay open-minded and question the status quo, particularly when dealing with a disease as complex as Alzheimer's.
Yeah, our understanding of the disease is constantly evolving,
Absolutely.
and so we need to adapt our research and our treatment approaches accordingly.
For sure.
Now, all of this is really fascinating from a research perspective,
Yeah.
but what does it mean for the listener, for those who are dealing with Alzheimer's in their own lives?
Well, I think it empowers you to have more informed conversations with your doctor about treatment options.
Okay.
If you or someone you know is facing Alzheimer's, don't hesitate to ask about Denpizol or Memantine, even if you know they've been labeled as just symptomatic.
Right. It's about advocating for yourself or your loved ones and exploring all the potential avenues for treatment.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to advocate for participation in clinical trials that use ethical control groups,
Right.
making sure that everyone receives at least a baseline level of care.
Absolutely. Being proactive and informed is key.
Yes.
You have the right to ask questions. You have the right to demand the best possible care and to be a part of shaping the future of Alzheimer's research.
I think this article by Kurkinen is a real wake-up call. It challenges us to think differently about Alzheimer's treatment and to prioritize what truly matters, quality of life, and how long that life can be.
It's a reminder that even with a disease as devastating as Alzheimer's, there's always hope. Research is ongoing, new discoveries are being made, and we're moving closer to finding effective treatments that can make a real difference.
This conversation about survival time as a key measure of success is just the beginning. We need to keep asking these tough questions, pushing for better treatments, and supporting research that puts the needs of patients front and center.
Absolutely. And before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with a thought-provoking question that's inspired by Kurkinen's work. Imagine a future where survival time is the gold standard for judging Alzheimer's treatment success. What would that mean for patients, doctors, the pharmaceutical industry?
That's a great question to consider.
Right.
How would clinical trials change? How would treatment decisions be made? How would we define success?
Right. And perhaps most importantly, how do we make sure that extending life doesn't come at the expense of quality of life?
That's a really important point.
It's a delicate balance to strike.
It is. We need to be mindful of, the potential ethical complexities of prolonging life without also addressing the cognitive and functional decline that so often accompanies Alzheimer's.
So as we conclude this deep dive, I hope our listeners leave with a sense of hope and a feeling of empowerment. The future of Alzheimer's treatment isn't set in stone. We've been talking about shifting the focus in Alzheimer's treatment to survival time.
Right.
It really makes you think differently about the whole approach, doesn't it?
It does. It really challenges how we measure success, how we design trials, what we prioritize when we care for people with Alzheimer's.
And one of the things that Kurkinen really emphasizes is this idea that this shift could lead to a more human-centered approach
Absolutely.
to treatment, one that really focuses on what matters to patients and their families.
Yeah, if you think about it, what do people facing a serious illness really want?
Right.
They want more time with their loved ones, more experiences, more time to cherish those moments, and that's what survival time represents.
It's about giving people the chance to live their lives for as long as possible, even with the diagnosis of Alzheimer's.
Yeah, exactly. And it goes beyond just extending lifespan. It's about acknowledging that quality of life is also important.
Right.
We want to make sure those extra days, weeks, or months are meaningful.
So it's not just adding years to life, but adding life to those years.
Exactly. And I think this shift in thinking could really change the whole field of Alzheimer's research and treatment.
And that will.
Well, imagine if pharmaceutical companies weren't just, focused on reducing amyloid plaques,
Right.
but really wanted to develop therapies that help people live longer, healthier lives.
That would be a huge change.
It would. And we might see funding priorities change too,
Okay.
with more resources going towards those so-called symptomatic drugs like donepezil and memantine.
Right, which have shown some promise in increasing survival time.
Exactly. It's like we've been overlooking a whole category of treatments because we were so focused on amyloid.
Right, and so this shift in focus might even lead to new treatment approaches,
Absolutely.
ones that target different aspects of the disease.
For sure.
Wow. But wouldn't there be some challenges in making this shift to focusing on survival time?
Oh, of course there would.
I mean, Alzheimer's is so complex and people experience it so differently.
Yeah, one of the biggest challenges would be figuring out how to account for all those individual variations.
Right.
The different stages of the disease, genetics, lifestyle, all
Yeah.
those factors.
It's a really complicated puzzle.
It is. And like we talked about earlier, we need to be careful that, the pursuit of longer survival doesn't come at the expense of quality of life.
Right. No one wants to prolong life if those extra years are without joy or connection or meaning.
Absolutely. It's about finding treatments that extend life, but also allow people to keep their dignity, their relationships, their sense of self.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into survival time and Alzheimer's, I think the main takeaway is that we're at a turning point in how we approach this disease.
I agree. And, Kurkinen's article really pushes us to rethink our assumptions, to look at things differently, and to really put the needs of those living with Alzheimer's first.
It's a call to action for everyone involved.
It is.
To advocate for a more human-centered approach